Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic actually comes to us from commenter Raph Hunter, who asks a question that seems simple on its face, but of course led me down a rabbit hole of research. But thank you, Rav Hunter. It is actually an excellent question, and it really was fascinating to look these details up. So, the question Rav Hunter asks is, which king is depicted in the statue of the fallen king that we see at the Crossroads in the Two Towers? In the movies, there is an extended scene. It's actually not in the Two Towers, it's in Return of the King. But we see the moment when Frodo, Sam, and Gollum are approaching the crossroads. They find this defaced statue, and they see the head of the king on the ground, and it has a wreath of flowers on it. And there's this little, it's a beautiful moment, actually. And it's one of those moments where Tolkien has a way of showing beauty and despair at the same time. And that's what this scene evokes, at least to me. So anyway, the question, good one, is it's a king of Gondor. Which king is this king who was sitting on a throne at the crossroads, and the orcs came along and chopped off the head and put on it an effigy, and so who is this? There is no clear answer to this question, Raph, unfortunately. It is not spelled out. I have a theory, and I will go through that theory for you. But in the meantime, I think it would be helpful to see a little bit of the history of the Crossroads, because I think that really plays into who this probably is. So first of all, I'm going to read you the passage from the Two Towers where Frodo, Sam, and Gollum approach the Crossroads. Now, they're approaching from the north. This is where they tried to go through the Black Gate, realized that was a terrible idea, and so they followed the road. It's called the Harad Road, the road that goes down south to Harad. And on the way, what Gollum wants them to, when they hit the crossroads, turn east and head toward Minas Morgul. Obviously, he wants to go to Cirith Ungol, where Shelob is, but that's the road that leads to Minas Morgul. That's the intention in this moment. So this passage is a little bit long. I edited it down, but I think I basically left in the stuff that really is necessary to evoke the meaning of this scene. So here we go. Journey to the Crossroads. Presently, not far ahead, looming up like a black wall, they saw a belt of trees. As they drew near, they became aware that these trees were of vast size, very ancient it seemed, and still towering high, though their tops were gaunt and broken, as if tempest and lightning blast had swept across them, but had failed to kill them or shake their fathomless roots. "The crossroads, yes," whispered Gollum, the first words he had spoken since they left their hiding place. "This is the only way," whispered Gollum. "No paths beyond the road. No paths. We must go to the crossroads. But make haste. Be silent." At length they reached the trees and found that they stood in a great roofless ring, open in the middle to the somber sky. In the very center, 4 ways met. Behind them lay the road to the Morannon. Before them, it ran out again upon its long journey south. To their right, the road from old Osgiliath came climbing up, and crossing, passed out eastward into darkness. The 4th way, the road they were to take. Standing there for a moment, filled with dread, Frodo became aware that a light was shining. He saw it glowing on Sam's face beside him. The sun was sinking, falling in an ominous fire towards the yet unsullied sea. The brief glow fell upon a huge sitting figure, still and solemn as the great stone kings of Argonath. The years had gnawed it, and violent hands had maimed it. Its head was gone, and in its place was set in mockery a round, rough-hewn stone, rudely painted by savage hands in the likeness of a grinning face, with one large red eye in the midst of its forehead. Upon its knees and mighty chair, and all about the pedestal were idle scrawls mixed with the foul symbols that the maggot folk of Mordor used. Suddenly, caught by the level beams, Frodo saw the old king's head. It was lying rolled away by the roadside. "Look, Sam!" he cried, startled into speech. "Look! The king has got a crown again!" The eyes were hollow, and the carven beard was broken. But about the high, stern forehead there was a coronal of silver and gold. A trailing plant with flowers like small white stars had bound itself across the brows as if in reverence for the fallen king. And in the crevices of his stony hair, yellow stonecrop gleamed. "They cannot conquer forever," said Frodo. And then suddenly, the brief glimpse was gone. The sun dipped and vanished, and as if at the shuddering of a lamp, black night fell. All right, so yes, there's this quote. They cannot conquer forever. It's this moment of hope for Frodo to say, you know what? This image of the king, this is the image of Gondor in its heyday. It's been, they've attempted to destroy it, and yet still nature has shown, given the king a crown. But then there's that extra little beat there where he finds his hope in the moment, and then the sun sinks and the light disappears. And so it's left again to say, oh, is all well? Which is just great. Tolkien, he's a master at that. And it really shows in this passage. Another thing that he's a master at is obviously backstory. Detail. His attention to detail is so amazing that the backstory to the Crossroads, which we don't really get a lot of, we hear parts of it in bits and pieces, but he doesn't synthesize it for you in Lord of the Rings. But it's so intricate and just full of amazing storycraft. For him to just have that as a background to the actual story is, it's amazing. Anyway, all right, so here is your backstory to the Crossroads. At the time of the Lord of the Rings, you've got Minas Tirith, and the road leads from Minas Tirith to the ruins of Osgiliath, across the River Anduin, and then on to Minas Morgul. Right, so Minas Tirith it's called the Tower of the Guard. Minas Morgul is called the Tower of Sorcery, and in the middle is Old Osgiliath. Okay, well, originally at the end of the Second Age, when Elendil, they've come from Numenor sank into the sea. Elendil and his family came to Middle Earth, and they've set up. So Elendil is the king of both Arnor and Gondor. Well, he founds a city up in Arnor, Annúminas. Annúminas is north of where the Shire is in the Third Age, so it's kind of up in that area of Middle Earth. And that's where he rules from. Well, his sons, Isildur and Anarion, are ruling Gondor together in conjunction. And they set up a capital at Osgiliath. All right? So, Osgiliath is defended by two towers. On the west of Osgiliath is Minas Anor. And then to the right of Osgiliath is Minas Ithil. Those are the two towers that eventually become known as Minas Tirith and Minas Morgul. Minas Anor is set up by Anarion. Minas Ithil is set up by Isildur. And that's very important. Their names actually give a clue as to what this is all about, right? So Minas Anor, the Tower of the Sun, is set up by Anarion. Anarion's name means the Sun's son. So it's not, the Sun's son sounds like he's a grandson. No, like S-U-N-S-O-N. So it's like the son of the sun. So in other words, the Tower of the Sun is named for Anarion. Minas Ithil, the Tower of the Moon, is named for Isildur. Isildur's name means servant of the moon. So Minas Ithil, and obviously when you think of in Lord of the Rings, there's the region known as Ithilien. It's the land of the moon that is named because Minas Ithil was once the name of that tower, which is now Minas Morgul. Okay, so you've got Minas Anor, Tower of the Sun, named for Anarion. You've got Minas Ithil, Tower of the Moon, named for Isildur. And in the middle, Osgiliath, which means Citadel of the Stars. It's got a few reasons for that name. One of those reasons might be that on the banner of Gondor, it has the 7 stars. I did a video about that. You can check that out. But one of the reasons I think that they named this the Citadel of the Stars is in honor of their dad, Elendil. Elendil means lover of the stars. And so you've got this family connection between these 3 cities, right? You've got the Tower of the Sun, Citadel of the Stars, Tower of the Moon. And they're all linked by this road, the east-west road that runs through them. Sadly, their great plan, this city planning that they did, doesn't last that long before bad things happen. Minas Ithil is attacked by Sauron pretty early on, maybe 100 years or so later. And it's retaken eventually, but the grand plan doesn't quite come off the way that they had hoped it would. Part of that planning involved the Palantiri, right? So each of those 3 cities had a Palantir in it. Minas Ithil, Osgiliath, and Minas Anor. That way they could all communicate with each other, as well as communicating with their dad up north. Eventually, when Minas Ithil falls and becomes Minas Morgul, it's that Palantir is the one that Sauron takes and then uses that to corrupt Saruman and Denethor, who at that time is the steward in Minas Tirith. So the Crossroads are very close to Minas Ithil. They're within a couple of miles. They're practically at the front gates. So you figure that this statue of the king had to have been built at a time when Gondor still had control of Minas Ithil. Minas Ithil becomes Minas Morgul in 2002 of the Third Age and doesn't really relinquish hands again until after the War of the Ring. So we know for a fact that that statue was made before 2002 of the Third Age. War of the Ring happens after the year, like 3019. That leaves us about 32 kings of Gondor, essentially, that are our potential suspects to be in this statue. But I would make a couple of assumptions. One, this statue and that ring of trees. There's a ring of trees, giant trees that are, made around the Crossroads. This is something that took some time and planning. This is something that would be done, I think, in a time of peace and prosperity. If you're in the middle of a war, you're probably not, too worried about making this perfect ring of trees and building this awesome statue. Same if you're in the middle of a famine, right? You don't want to spend that money that you would be feeding your people trying to make this commemorative art installation, right? So with that in mind, I think we can move the dates back a little bit. One thing that happens in the year 1636 is the Great Plague. Great Plague comes out of Mordor from the east, sweeps west. And while we don't see exactly what happened to Minas Ithil, which at that point is still Minas Ithil, it does say that it affected all of the major cities, worse than, say, the countrysides. So we can assume that Minas Ithil got hit by the plague. Osgiliath definitely got hit by the plague. Just decimates it, kills the king at that point. The king of Gondor, Telemnar, and his kids are killed by the plague. Kills a vast number of the population of Osgiliath, and most people just leave the city and never come back. So I would say, since this the statue and the ring of trees are built on this road between Osgiliath and Minas Ithil, since Osgiliath is in such terrible straits from then on, it doesn't seem like that's where you would build that. So I think this statue was not built after the Great Plague. So that gets rid of a couple of potential kings. Another event happens to Osgiliath that I think impacts the dating of the king, which is about 200 years before the plague is the kin strife. This is where there's a coup, and Castamir the usurper destroys Osgiliath, burns it, lays siege to it, and then burns it. And again, it just really weakens the city. The city never recovers, and then you throw a great plague on it 200 years later, and that pretty much wipes the city out. The city is reclaimed by the king who was overthrown originally by Castamir. That's Eldacar. Eldacar manages to take back the city. And maybe you could say, oh, you know what? To commemorate taking back Gondor. Maybe it's Eldacar that is sitting on that throne. And that's a possibility. I would say, though, that probably if he's going to commemorate his great victory to retake Gondor from Castamir the Usurper, he probably does it at the site where that happened. And the site where that happened is actually farther south. It's on the road to Pelargir. It was the Battle of the Crossings of Eroe, which is not, it's not at this location. I would think that's where you'd probably put the big statue to go like, aha, see, I conquered in this moment. And so I think it's unlikely that this statue is of Eldacar. So now we've got our list of suspects is from 1437 or earlier. It leaves us about 20 kings. From here, it could be just about any of them. I looked to see if maybe there's a king that died in his 20s or something like that, for instance, where he didn't have the big beard that we see in this. But no, they pretty much are all long-lived. You can make a case for most of them, I think. But I think there is a likely candidate. The verbiage that stands out to me is like, I'll bet you that's the hint, is when Tolkien writes, "The brief glow fell upon a huge sitting figure, still and solemn as the great stone kings of Argonath." I think we look back at the Argonath, which was constructed by Romendasil II, and he falls into this range of 20 possible kings. Originally, Romendasil II is named Minalcar. He is a king regent. He's not technically the king, but the acting king is elderly, and he leaves control of Gondor to Minalcar. Minalcar has a war going with the Easterlings, and he wins this great victory in 1248. And so to commemorate that victory, he commissions the building of the Argonath. The Argonath are those two huge statues you see in the movies. The movies are a little different than the books in that the actual two statues are Anarion and Isildur, the two brothers. I think the movies try to maybe make it more like Elendil and Isildur. They kind of push Anarion to the side a bit. But in any case, so also Minalcar renames himself Romendasil II because Romendasil means East Victor. So he's, again, commemorating this victory over the Easterlings. So the Argonath is built to commemorate this event, but also to mark the northern border of Gondor. So that, on the river, when you come to that spot, you know, like, okay, you've hit Gondorian lands at that point. Also, he is still a king regent, I believe. We don't know the exact dates that the Argonath was built, but he doesn't become king until I think it's 1304. So he's got 50 years or so where he's acting as a regent. And so I feel like maybe that's the reason he didn't build a statue of himself. He's not technically the king in that moment. And so instead, he associates himself with the great kings of old. And again, the fact that he's marking that northern boundary, I think, is important. So my theory is he did the same thing along the eastern border. We know that Romendasil II fortifies the banks of the Anduin. The Anduin more or less marks the eastern boundary, in most cases, of Gondor's lands. So if he's fortifying those banks, one thing he's going to be fortifying is Osgiliath. Osgiliath actually is on each side of the Anduin. And so in fortifying the Anduin, he comes to Osgiliath, fortifies that. He realizes that at that point in their territory, their lands actually extend past the Anduin into Ithilien. And so I think perhaps at these crossroads, these very important economic engine that are these crossroads, he decides to do similar to the Argonath, build this statue. It's a time of peace and prosperity. We know he's already building the Argonath up north. And so who would he build that statue of? It has to be Isildur, right? I mean, he's building it in Ithilien, the land of the moon, named for the servant of the moon. It is near the gates of Minas Ithil, founded by Isildur. It just makes all the sense in the world that that's Isildur that is being commemorated in this circle of trees at the Crossroads. So just to wrap up the story of the Crossroads, there is actually another passage that describes the Crossroads in Lord of the Rings. It's from Return of the King, and instead of Frodo, Sam, and Gollum coming south, what we've got is Aragorn and his army coming east. So this is that moment when Aragorn leads the army out of Minas Tirith through the ruins of Osgiliath, and they head to the Crossroads where they turn north, and then they eventually confront the mouth of Sauron at the Black Gate. But it's on that journey that they reach the Crossroads, and they find this defaced statue. So I'm going to read you that passage. Here we go. The vanguard passed on through the ruins of old Gondor and over the wide river, and on up the long straight road that in the high days had been made to run from the fair tower of the sun to the tall tower of the moon, which now was Minas Morgul in its accursed vale. 5 miles beyond Osgiliath they halted, ending their first day's march, but the horsemen pressed on, and ere evening they came to the Crossroads and the great ring of trees, and all was silent. Then Aragorn set trumpeters at each of the 4 roads that ran into the ring of trees, and they blew a great fanfare, and the heralds cried aloud, "The lords of Gondor have returned, and all this land that is theirs they take back." The hideous orc head that was set upon the carven figure was cast down and broken in pieces, and the old king's head was raised and set in its place once more, still crowned with white and golden flowers, and men labored to wash and pare away all the foul scrawls that orcs had put upon the stone. So the next day, when the main host came up, they set a strong guard upon the Crossroads to make some defense, if Mordor should send a force over the Morgul Pass, or should bring more men up from the south. For that guard they chose mostly archers, who knew the ways of Ithilien, and would lie hid in the woods and slopes about the meeting of the ways. So there you go. Aragorn puts the statue back in place. They try to get the graffiti off of it. And they set up a guard. They show again how strategic these crossroads are. It's a reason why maybe I'm mentioning that Remendesil chose this place to put up a, hey, you're in Gondor now. Because this is a very strategic location. And so, yes, they set up archers there just in case there are some enemy armies that come marching through. Also, if that is, in fact, Isildur, it's a nice moment there where Aragorn is paying attention to his kin that is so connected to him in many ways. So I think, again, that there's a reasonable chance that this is, in fact, Isildur's statue. So, of course, as I mentioned, Tolkien's brilliance in all of these wonderful webs and side stories. I'm going to leave you with one little side note that I found that I knew about, but again, didn't synthesize it all into this grander story. And it's the story of the Boromir for whom the Boromir of Lord of the Rings is named, who at one point was the steward of Gondor, lived about 500 years before Boromir that we know. I'm going to read you the passage. This is from the appendix from Lord of the Rings. It's a short little passage that describes Boromir, but it's got so much in it that you can dissect. It's really interesting. So here we go. And this impacts our talk about the Crossroads. So this particular Boromir lives like 2400 or so. Obviously, Minas Ithil has already fallen. It's become Minas Morgul at this time. Osgiliath, long ago, the plague just ripped it apart, but it's still technically in Gondor's hands. And so here we go. This is the description of that time in Gondor's history. In the last years of Denethor I, the race of Uruks first appeared out of Mordor, and in 2475 they swept across Ithilien and took Osgiliath. Boromir, son of Denethor, after whom Boromir of the Nine Walkers was later named, defeated them and regained Ithilien. But Osgiliath was finally ruined, and its great stone bridge was broken. No people dwelt there afterwards. Boromir was a great captain, and even the Witch King feared him. He was noble and fair of face, a man strong in body and in will. But he received a Morgul wound in that war, which shortened his days, and he became shrunken with pain and died 12 years after his father. So wow, that's just like fascinating stuff. All right, so we see that in 2475, there was a point in time when the Uruk-hai retook Osgiliath temporarily. Boromir, steward of Gondor at that time, again, a son of a Denethor. So the Denethor the First had a son, Boromir. Later, Denethor the Second has a son, Boromir. But this Boromir, 500 years before the one we know, retakes Osgiliath. In doing so, he is hit with a Morgul wound, which, yeah, he dies young, comparatively young. And so the fact that the Witch King fears him, it's a huge standout, right? The Witch King is fearless, essentially, right? He's like, no, I can't die, I'm immortal. But somehow still has some fear of Boromir. And I would argue a Morgul wound is made by very specific weapons. There aren't that many of them out there. It's not like all the orcs were running around with Morgul blades. We know, obviously Frodo is stabbed on Weathertop by the Witch King with a Morgul blade. I think there's a fair case to make that perhaps Boromir fought the Witch King. The Witch King stabbed him. Maybe with the same blade that he later stabs Frodo with. Could be. But just a fascinating moment. This is the very end of Osgiliath as a city, right? It says no one lived there after this. 2475, Osgiliath is still hanging in there. It's essentially a ruin, but maybe some people still live there. After this, it just becomes a war zone. You've got Gondor on the west side of the river, and Sauron's forces on the east side of the river, and no one's going to live there because it would just be insane. And so you see that moment. The stone bridge is broken. They can't cross the river by those means anymore. That is part of the road. So the road is split. And so I thought it was interesting because it does connect into this. The history of the Crossroads has a bit of a tragic moment here, 2475, when we see the namesake of Boromir that we know in the Lord of the Rings suffers a Morgul wound, saving Osgiliath from enemy hands. So there you go. Raph, I hope that at least someone answers your question. I think that the fallen king is in fact Isildur, and that statue was put up by Romendasil II to commemorate his great victory over the Easterlings. So yeah, if you have some theories of your own on who that might be, please put them in the comments. Love to read them. But yeah, thanks a lot, everybody, and we will see you next time